The boarding gate had been its usual chaos. Families juggling children and bags, business travelers clutching laptops, young couples whispering in low excitement about their vacations ahead. She had slipped through it all with quiet efficiency, boarding pass in hand, avoiding eye contact with anyone. For her, airports were not places of wonder or adventure. They were simply thresholds, noisy spaces to be endured before the silence of the skies returned. Row 10 had been her choice, as always. Close enough to the front to exit quickly, far enough back to avoid the bustle of the galley and lavatories. She slid into the seat by the window, her small leather bag tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of her. She wore no uniform now, no medals, no visible markers of the life she once led. To anyone looking, she was only a tired woman in jeans and a light jacket, perhaps in her late 30s, with a posture that suggested both discipline and restraint. The flight attendant offered her a practiced smile as passengers funneled past, struggling with overhead bins. "Good evening," the attendant said. She nodded politely, saying nothing. Words, she had learned, could be wasted. Silence often revealed more. She rested her head lightly against the seat, the hum of boarding chatter washing over her. A toddler kicked the back of her seat once, twice, until a weary father offered an apology. She merely raised a hand in acknowledgement. No annoyance, no anger. She was trained to endure worse than this. The engines outside coughed to life, a deep vibration rattling through the fuselage. The sound was oddly soothing to her. It reminded her of beginnings, of takeoffs into dark skies, of adrenaline pumping as runways blurred beneath steel wings. Her eyes closed for a moment, and her breathing slowed. The ordinary traveler might have been nervous, but for her, the hum of jet engines was closer to a lullaby. Around her, the rituals of flight unfolded. Passengers buckled belts, stowed phones, flicked through in-flight magazines. A teenager 2 rows ahead fumbled with earbuds. A woman in the aisle seat of row 10 began a whispered phone call, hurriedly telling someone she'd text after landing. A businessman across the aisle powered down his laptop with exaggerated frustration, as if the rules were an offense to his schedule. She took none of it indirectly. Instead, she drifted into her own quiet cocoon, her focus fixed on the small oval window. The last lights of the airport flashed by as the plane taxied, then paused, engines deepening in tone. For a moment, the cabin hushed, a collective intake of breath as metal prepared to lift into sky. She closed her eyes as the plane accelerated. The pressure of takeoff pressed her into the seat, a familiar force. Around her, a child squealed in delight, while another passenger muttered a nervous prayer. She remained still, hands folded loosely in her lap. The ascent was smooth, steady, unremarkable to most. But to her, every vibration, every change in pitch was instantly recognizable. She could read an aircraft like some people read faces. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign chimed off, releasing passengers into restless motion. Carts rattled down the aisles, filling the air with the scent of reheated meals and coffee. A baby began to cry. Laughter erupted from a group of college students several rows back. The mundane life of a plane in flight resumed, a temporary village suspended miles above the earth. She remained withdrawn, slipping deeper into herself. She had learned to conserve energy on long journeys, to fold inward and find rest even in chaos. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders softened. To anyone glancing her way, she looked asleep. But she was never truly asleep. Not here. Years of training had wired her differently. Even when her eyes closed, her senses stayed alert. She registered footsteps of the flight attendants, the click of the lavatory door, the uneven breathing of the nervous passenger behind her. She knew the rhythm of an aircraft in stable flight. Any shift, a subtle drop of altitude, an engine strain, an unusual announcement, would rouse her instantly. She told herself this flight would be like all the others since she'd left the service. Uneventful, forgettable, just a passage between 2 points on the map. Yet something in her gut tugged differently tonight. She could not name it, not yet. It was the instinct every pilot carried, that whisper of anticipation when skies seemed too calm. Her gaze drifted briefly to the cabin around her. So many lives gathered here, each sealed in their own story. The mother soothing her crying infant. The young couple scrolling through honeymoon photos. The businessman already making notes for tomorrow's meeting. None of them could know how fragile this moment was, how quickly the quiet of flight could fracture. She leaned her head back again, closing her eyes. She wanted to believe in ordinary peace, in the anonymity she had chosen. She wanted row 10 to remain just a seat, nothing more. But fate, she knew, had never been so predictable. Minutes slipped by in steady rhythm. The clink of drink glasses, the hiss of the air system, the low murmur of conversations. She let herself drift further into a half-sleep, though her mind still lingered at the edges, attentive. Then, faintly at first, the intercom chimed. A sound so routine, it should have blended into the background. But her eyes opened instantly, her posture straightening before the captain even spoke. The voice that followed was calm, but there was something beneath it. A tension, a weight. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, "may I have your attention, please?" She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. Something was coming. Something that would change row 10 forever. And then the words fell, slicing through the cabin like a blade. "If there are any combat pilots on board, please make yourself known." The first few seconds after the captain's words were not silence, but something stranger, an airless pause, as if the entire cabin had forgotten how to breathe. The message hung above their heads like smoke, lingering, spreading, heavy with implication. "If there are any combat pilots on board, please make yourself known." The request was so out of place, so absurd, that for a heartbeat, some passengers thought they had misheard. A ripple of whispers broke the stillness. Heads turned. Eyebrows furrowed. People leaned into the aisles to exchange confused glances with strangers. A businessman 2 rows behind her snorted softly, his voice pitched low, but carrying in the tight quarters. "What is this, a joke?" His tone tried to sound dismissive, but the tremor beneath betrayed unease. A young mother clutched her toddler closer, as if the very words had sharpened the air around them. Why would the captain say that? She murmured to her husband, who looked as baffled as she did. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. They had mastered the art of plastering calm smiles over minor turbulence or a spilled drink, but this was different. Even their practiced faces cracked, their brows tightening, their steps faltering, as they rolled the beverage cart back toward the galley. She sat very still in row 10, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. Outwardly, she was as composed as ever. But inside, her heart had begun a slow, deliberate hammering, the kind of beat that came before a decision. The captain's voice returned, firmer now, as if to erase any notion of misunderstanding. "This is not a test. If there are any combat-trained pilots on board, please make yourself known to a member of the cabin crew immediately." The whispers swelled into murmurs, the murmurs into a low tide of anxious chatter. A teenager in the row ahead twisted in his seat, eyes wide. "Combat pilots? Like military? What's going on?" "Probably some drunk passenger in the cockpit," someone suggested, though the laugh that followed was hollow. "No," another voice countered, sharper, quieter. The way he said it, that wasn't a joke. Fear, once seated, spread quickly in a cabin. It fed on itself, each whisper growing sharper, each theory more dramatic than the last. The woman in row 10 didn't need their guesses. She had lived enough hours in cockpits to recognize the undertone in the captain's voice. He was calm, yes, but not the calm of control. It was the calm of someone who had been forced into a corner. Her instinct was to act, but instinct collided with resolve. She had promised herself years ago that she was done. She had walked away from that world of noise and pressure and life or death decisions. Now she was just a passenger. Her eyes closed just for a moment, as if she could will herself invisible. Let someone else respond. Surely among 200 passengers, there had to be someone else. But as the minutes ticked forward, silence answered the captain's plea. No hand rose. No voice called out. The cabin began to shift from confusion to something more primal fear dressed in questions. What could they need a combat pilot for? Isn't the captain trained enough? Maybe it's medical. Maybe one of the pilots is sick. Sick? That doesn't make sense. He asked for combat pilots, not doctors. The theories churned in the air like turbulence, bouncing from row to row, each one pulling the atmosphere tighter. People craned their necks, scanning the passengers as if a savior might stand up, announce themselves, and walk down the aisle like a character in a film. She stayed seated, her spine straight, her face impassive. But her body betrayed her. A fine tremor had begun in her fingertips, an old reflex awakening after years of dormancy. She pressed her hands harder into her lap, willing them to stillness. The intercom chimed again. The captain's voice, though still professional, carried a sharper edge. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you this is not a drill. If there are any former combat pilots among her passengers, please alert the crew immediately. The cabin seemed to shrink with the weight of the words. Even those who had tried to dismiss the first announcement could no longer deny it. Something was happening. Something serious. And now, all eyes turned inward, not toward her specifically. Not yet, but toward the question itself. Was there someone here who could answer? Someone who could step forward? The man in the aisle seat beside her, a middle-aged traveler with tired eyes and a wrinkled shirt, exhaled shakily. Combat pilot, he muttered under his breath. Then louder, as though testing the idea. There's no way someone like that would just be here on this plane? He shook his head. That's movies. That's not real life. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to agree. She wanted to stay ordinary, invisible, unremarkable. She had worked so hard to build that kind of life. But deep down, she knew the truth he denied. Yes, sometimes life did play out like the movies. Sometimes the impossible request came, unannounced, uninvited. And sometimes the one person who could answer it was sitting exactly where no one expected. Her breathing slowed, as it always did when a decision loomed. It was the rhythm of checklists, of runways stretching out ahead, of cockpits bathed in red light. She could feel the weight of her past pressing against the thin fabric of the present. Behind her, someone laughed nervously, too loudly. Maybe Tom Cruise is back there, right? A few chuckles followed, brittle and forced, the kind of laughter that had more to do with terror than humor. She didn't laugh. She couldn't. Her eyes drifted to the flight attendants clustered near the galley. They were trying to keep their movements casual, but their clipped whispers and darting glances betrayed them. One of them scanned the rows, her gaze flicking briefly over row 10 before sliding on. Searching, hoping, silently pleading. The woman in row 10 leaned her head against the seat, her jaw tightening. This was not her fight. Not anymore. And yet, her gut told her what her mind tried to deny. The captain would not have spoken unless it was critical. Pilots didn't gamble with words at 30,000 feet. Whatever was wrong, it was urgent enough to pierce the veil of passenger comfort, urgent enough to beg for help from strangers. Her hands itched, not with fear, but with memory. She could still feel the grip of a control stick, the heavy gloves, the vibration of engines under her command. The sensation had never left her, no matter how much distance she put between herself and that life. For now, she remained in her seat, outwardly unmoved, her eyes fixed on the tray table in front of her. But inside, a storm had begun. The captain's words had shattered the fragile illusion of anonymity. Row 10 was no longer a refuge. It was a threshold. And sooner or later, she would have to decide whether to step across it. The cabin, buzzing with speculation and fear, had no idea that their answer sat among them already. The voices around her faded into a low hum, like distant static. She heard them, yes theories, questions, nervous laughter, but they slid past her consciousness, blurring into background noise. What cut sharper than all of it was the echo of the captain's voice. Combat pilots. The words weren't just a request. They were a key, and the moment they struck her ears, they unlocked a door she had spent years barricading. Memories, long buried under civilian routines and quiet nights, spilled out with relentless force. She was no longer in row 10. She was back in the cockpit of a fighter jet, 23 years old, her hands gripping the stick as the desert sun poured through the canopy. The sky had been endless, blinding, a place of both freedom and threat. The radio in her helmet had crackled with clipped commands, her call sign bouncing back and forth in rapid-fire exchanges. Every decision had been seconds long, every second capable of reshaping lives. She remembered the weight of that helmet, the way it pressed against her temples, the faint smell of oil and metal that clung to everything. She remembered missions that started with briefing rooms, full of laughter, and ended in silence. Seats left empty where friends had once sat. The first time she'd been fired upon, she had felt the missile's lock as much as heard the warning in her headset. Her heart had frozen, but her training had taken over. Barrel roll, flare release, engine screaming as the jet tore through the air. She had survived that day, not because of luck, but because her hands and mind had moved faster than fear. Her chest tightened at the memory of her first confirmed hit. The target had been marked hostile, the order clear. She had pressed the trigger. Fire and smoke had erupted far below, a bloom of destruction she could not unsee. Even after the mission was over, even after the medal was pinned to her chest, the image followed her into sleep, a shadow that never loosened its grip. There had been camaraderie, too, fierce and unshakable. Nights when she and her squadron shared jokes, so sharp they made their ribs ache, laughter echoing into the desert air. They had been young, invincible, or so they thought. Until one by one, faces she loved disappeared, lost to mechanical failures, ambushes, mistakes that no training could erase. She still carried them. Every name, every call sign, every voice cut short mid-transmission. They rode with her, silent passengers in the quieter years that followed. Civilian life had been her attempt at escape. No more adrenaline, no more loss. Just quiet flights booked with points, a small apartment with unremarkable furniture, mornings spent with coffee instead of mission briefings. She had become ordinary by design. Ordinary was safety. Ordinary was healing. And yet, ordinary had never fit her fully. The habits lingered. She scanned exits in every building she entered. She timed her walks down streets, subconsciously calculating angles of approach and cover. When she sat in a restaurant, she always chose the seat with her back to the wall. She had told herself it was just muscle memory, fading echoes. But deep down, she knew the truth. Once you lived as a pilot, you never truly stopped being one. The captain's request pressed that truth into her chest like a blade. She had tried to believe she was done. She had taken off the uniform, boxed up the medals, left behind the world where her skills meant life and death. She had told herself she was just another passenger in row 10, one of hundreds with nothing extraordinary hidden beneath. But the voice over the intercom reminded her otherwise. She opened her eyes, staring at the tray table, but her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the flood of images forcing themselves into focus. She saw the flash of a desert dawn, her jet casting a long shadow over endless dunes. She saw a night sky lit with tracer fire, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of survival. She saw herself walking off the tarmac one final time, swearing never to return. The woman she had become, a quiet traveler in civilian clothes, was only a shell. Beneath it, the pilot remained, waiting. Her hand twitched, a ghost of the motions she once performed thousands of times. Thumb over a button, fingers curling around a throttle, eyes flicking over instruments, processing numbers faster than thought. She had been forged for that world, for emergencies, for crises like the one now crackling, unsaid but undeniable, through the plane. She shifted slightly in her seat, exhaling through her nose. No one noticed her. Passengers were too caught up in their own storm of fear. That anonymity had been her shield for years. But the longer she sat, the heavier the memories grew, pressing down like gravity. She remembered the last words of her commanding officer the day she resigned. "You can leave the service, but you'll never leave the sky. One day, it'll call you back. And when it does, you won't ignore it." At the time, she had bristled. She had sworn she would never answer again. But here, at 30,000 feet, those words had proven true. The sky had called her once more, not with orders, not with duty, but with the desperate voice of a captain running out of options. The hum of the engines filled her ears. She counted the rhythm without realizing it, the way she once did mid-mission. Steady for now. But how long would that steadiness last? If one pilot was incapacitated, if the captain was struggling, how close were they to real danger? Her memories were no longer just ghosts. They were instructions resurfacing, checklists, emergency protocols. 1,000 hours of training whispering into her bones. She clenched her hands together in her lap. She could stay silent. She could let the plane land or crash without ever revealing herself. No one here knew her history. She could walk off at the destination and vanish into the crowd, just another anonymous traveler. But could she live with the knowledge that she might have been the difference? Her memories had given her no peace. Now they gave her no choice. Row 10 was shrinking around her, pressing her inward, squeezing her chest. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, trying to silence the roar of her past. But silence would not come. Instead, the past whispered louder. The roar of engines, the bark of commands, the steady, unflinching voice in her own head. Do something. And for the first time in years, she realized that her story as a pilot wasn't over. It had only been waiting. She sat perfectly still in row 10, but inside her, a storm was raging. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, yet the faintest tremor ran through her fingers, betraying the battle within. The captain's words continued to echo in her head, refusing to fade. "If there are any combat-trained pilots on board, please make yourself known." The request wasn't going away. Neither was the silence that followed it. All around her, passengers fidgeted in their seats, leaning into aisles, whispering in anxious tones. The atmosphere inside the cabin was electric now, charged with a fear that no amount of forced laughter could disguise. Some tried to joke about it, others theorized loudly, but beneath every word was the same question. What was wrong? And worse, who would step forward? Her eyes remained fixed on the seatback in front of her, but her hearing had sharpened, pulling in fragments of conversations from every direction. He can't be serious. Why would a pilot need? Another pilot? Something happened up there. Has to be. I don't like this. Not one bit. I knew I should have taken the train. The murmur of voices blended with the mechanical hum of the engines, creating a strange symphony of dread. She had lived through battlefields where fear clung to every breath, but this was different. Here, fear was blind. No one knew the enemy, the threat, or even if danger was real. Except her. She knew. Not the details, not the shape of the emergency, but the tone of the captain's voice had told her enough. He was trained never to alarm passengers unnecessarily. To break that barrier, to ask for help so openly, it meant something was very wrong. Her instinct screamed to move, to stand, to act. That old, familiar pull of duty surged through her veins like lightning. But alongside it came the heavy chains of her promise to herself. I'm done. That life is over. She shifted slightly, glancing sideways at the man seated beside her. He was scrolling his phone nervously, refreshing the same email screen over and over, though Wi-Fi was disabled. His foot tapped against the floor, restless. She wondered what he would think if he knew who sat next to him. Not a civilian. Not an anonymous traveler, but someone who had once guided steel through combat skies, who had stared death in the face and lived to tell no one. Would he look at her differently? Would any of them? She had left that life, partly because of the weight of others' eyes, the awe, the questions, the pedestal, the expectations. People imagined combat pilots as untouchable heroes, fearless warriors. They never saw the cracks, the sleepless nights, the moments of trembling hands after missions. She had carried enough of that judgment. Here, in row 10, she had anonymity. She was just another passenger, invisible and safe. And for years, that invisibility had been her shield. But the captain's plea had pierced it. She closed her eyes, steadying her breathing the way she used to before high-risk sorties. Inhale, exhale. Calm the body, calm the mind. And then came the question she could no longer ignore. If not me, then who? The silence in the cabin was growing heavier. No one else was moving. No hand had risen. No voice had spoken. She thought of the passengers, the mother with her baby 3 rows back, the students laughing nervously, the weary travelers just wanting to get home. They were depending on someone they didn't even know they needed. Depending on her. Her chest tightened with the weight of it. Responsibility had always been her shadow. She had tried to outrun it, but it had found her again, here at 30,000 feet. She remembered her commanding officer's words, echoing like prophecy. One day, the sky will call you back. And when it does, you won't ignore it. Her eyes opened. She couldn't. With deliberate slowness, she unclasped her hands and rested them on the armrests, grounding herself. She inhaled deeply. Her heartbeat steadied. Her decision was made. She turned slightly, catching the attention of the nearest flight attendant. The young woman was standing stiffly near the galley, her smile forced as she reassured a passenger about turbulence that wasn't even there. Their eyes met, just for a second, and in that second, the flight attendant saw something in her gaze. Calm, authority, certainty. The woman in row 10 lifted her hand, subtle but firm, a signal meant only for the crew. The attendant blinked and approached quickly, leaning close. Yes, ma'am? Do you need something? Her voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of truth she could no longer hide. Tell the captain. She paused, almost tasting the years of silence breaking. Tell him I'm a combat pilot. I can help. The flight attendant froze for the briefest of moments, her eyes widening, shock breaking through her mask of professionalism. Then she nodded quickly, her hand gripping the edge of the seat as though anchoring herself. Yes, ma'am. Right away. The words hung in the air, invisible to the rest of the cabin, but monumental to her. With them, She had crossed the line she had sworn she never would. There was no going back now. The flight attendant hurried forward, disappearing behind the cockpit door. A few passengers glanced curiously, but no announcement followed. The woman in row 10 sat straighter, her eyes on the floor, feeling the weight of every second stretch into eternity. Her seatmate finally noticed her stillness. He gave a nervous laugh. "Guess we're about to find out what's going on, huh?" She offered only the faintest nod. He had no idea that the answer to his question was sitting right beside him. When the cockpit door cracked open and a uniformed figure gestured toward her, she felt a shift ripple through the cabin. A few heads turned. Whispers began again, soft and speculative. But she rose silently, smoothing her jacket, her movements calm and controlled. Her eyes didn't meet the passengers. She had no need for their recognition. Her focus was forward, toward the cockpit, toward the unknown waiting inside, toward the sky that had called her back at last. A cockpit door shut behind her with a heavy click, sealing away the murmurs of the passengers and the illusion of calm in the cabin. In front of her stretched a wall of blinking lights, switches, and digital displays, glowing against the dimmed space like the instruments of some futuristic cathedral. For a moment, she stood frozen at the threshold. The air was warmer here, filled with the hum of electronics and the faint smell of coffee gone cold. And in that space, two worlds collided, her past life roaring back against the present she had so carefully constructed. The captain glanced back, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. He was a man in his early 50s, his face lined but resolute, his hands steady on the controls. Yet beneath the calm professionalism was something else, fatigue, worry, and the weight of command pressing heavy. "You're the one?" he asked, his tone clipped, urgent. She gave a sharp nod. Former Air Force, combat pilot. The words tasted strange on her tongue, like dust brushed off an old uniform. Relief flickered in his eyes, brief but unmistakable. He motioned to the co-pilot's chair, empty except for a crumpled headset and a bottle of water. My first officer collapsed. Severe medical issue. We've got a doctor working on him in the jump seat, but he's out cold. I can't do this alone for the next 5 hours. His voice softened, just for a beat. I need another set of hands. She swallowed hard, stepping deeper into the cockpit. The seat loomed before her, larger and bulkier than the cockpits she remembered, yet somehow familiar. Her fingers brushed the armrest, and 1,000 memories surged, gripping a fighter stick, scanning radar screens, feeling the jolt of afterburners. Except this wasn't a fighter jet. This was a behemoth of steel and wings, a commercial airliner carrying hundreds of lives. The stakes were different, but no less dire. She lowered herself into the seat, the leather creaking under her weight. For a second, she simply breathed, steadying herself. Then, almost without thinking, her hands began moving. Seat adjustment. Harness buckle. Oxygen mask check. Headset on. The motions were different here, more complex, but the rhythm was the same. Prepare. Focus. Engage. The captain watched her, gauging. When was the last time you flew? Her lips curved into the faintest, almost self-deprecating smile. Not like this. But trust me, the skies haven't changed. He gave a short nod. Good enough. Her eyes flicked across the panels, scanning instruments she hadn't touched before. The digital displays glowed with numbers, altitude, speed, navigation routes. Her brain absorbed them, piece by piece, until they began to make sense. This wasn't the razor-fast cockpit of a fighter jet, where every decision meant life or death in a split second. This was slower, steadier, but in some ways more daunting. Here, responsibility wasn't measured in missions completed, but in souls carried safely home. She adjusted her headset, listening to the soft murmur of air traffic control in her ear. Her pulse quickened at the sound, a language she hadn't spoken in years, but still understood. "All right," the captain said, voice steady but firm. "I'll handle communications and most of the navigation. What I need is someone who can monitor systems, watch our flight path, and if things go south, help me get this bird on the ground." Her throat tightened, but her voice was sure. "Understood." The words settled into the space like a contract signed. She was no longer a passenger, no longer the quiet woman in row 10. She was part of the cockpit now. The captain guided her through the essentials, pointing to displays, explaining systems quickly but clearly. She absorbed it like a sponge, her mind snapping into old patterns, triaging information, prioritizing threats, compartmentalizing fear. At one point, turbulence rattled the plane, jostling the controls. The captain's hand tightened on the yoke, but she reached instinctively for the stabilizer trim, her motion swift and precise. The captain shot her a glance, eyebrows raised. Muscle memory? She allowed herself the faintest shrug. Something like that. They shared a look then, an unspoken understanding between aviators who knew the sky could be both ally and enemy. Minutes bled into each other as she settled deeper into the rhythm of flight. The noise of the cabin was gone, replaced by the quiet intensity of switches, dials, and readouts. Her earlier doubts had faded, replaced by the clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in years. And yet, beneath the surface, she felt the weight pressing in. Every passenger was counting on her now, though none of them knew her name. The responsibility was crushing, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from who she was. She was living it. The captain's voice cut through her thoughts. "You've got good instincts." "I can tell." She glanced at him, then back at the horizon glowing faintly ahead. "Instincts kept me alive. Let's hope they can keep all of us alive, too." A beat of silence followed. Then, for the first time since she'd stepped inside, the captain allowed himself the smallest smile. "Welcome back to the sky, pilot." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her hands rested lightly on the controls now, not tense, not hesitant. Just steady, ready. In that moment, she was no longer row 10, no longer a woman hiding in anonymity. She was exactly where she was meant to be, in the cockpit, with the sky calling her name. And this time, she wasn't ignoring it. The horizon ahead looked deceptively serene, streaks of orange fading into indigo, the slow descent of daylight surrendering to night. From the cockpit window, it was the kind of view that made people fall in love with flying. But beauty had always been a camouflage for danger, and she had learned long ago never to trust a quiet sky. Her headset crackled with the voice of air traffic control, monotone but steady, reporting a shift in weather patterns along their route. A cold front was sweeping in from the west, dragging turbulence like a shadow behind it. The captain muttered under his breath, adjusting the controls. "We'll hit shop in about 10 minutes. Nothing severe, but tonight, I'd prefer not to test fate." She nodded, her eyes narrowing on the weather radar glowing at the center console. To most, it would look like a blur of colors and lines. To her, it was a map of moods, the sky's temperament painted in shades of green, yellow, and red. The blotches were thickening, merging like bruises spreading across skin. "We're not skirting this one," she said softly. "We're going through it." The captain shot her a glance. She didn't waver. He gave a grim nod. A few minutes later, the first tremor shivered through the aircraft, a ripple so slight that most passengers probably dismissed it as a bump. But in the cockpit, both pilots stiffened. She reached instinctively for the stabilizer trim, her fingers moving with the same assurance she once used in combat maneuvers. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and trays clattered in the galley behind them. Her pulse quickened, but her hands were steady. Calm was her armor, the thing that separated aviators from everyone else when the sky decided to turn hostile. The cockpit lights dimmed briefly as the plane hit a pocket of rough air. Warning chimes flickered to life, shrill and demanding. A system alert flashed on the panel. Autopilot struggling to maintain altitude. Manual override, the captain barked. She was already moving. Fingers flew across switches, disengaging systems with the grace of someone who had lived for this rhythm. The yoke felt heavy in her hands, far heavier than the joystick of a fighter jet. But the sensation was familiar enough. The same weight of responsibility, the same demand for control. The plane dropped suddenly, a stomach-lurching dip that sent overhead bins rattling and passengers gasping behind the closed door. "Altitude loss," she said sharply, reading the gauges. "I see it." The captain's voice was taut, but his eyes flicked to her with a silent question. "Can you handle this?" She tightened her grip, drawing a breath that steadied the storm inside her. "I've got it." Together, they guided the aircraft through the turbulent air, one adjusting throttle while the other balanced pitch and roll. Her hands responded with instinct, micro-corrections smoothing the ride, muscles remembering what her mind had tried so long to bury. The aircraft bucked again, but she leaned into it, anticipating the movement, countering with precision. Where others might panic, she felt a strange, almost eerie clarity. It was as though the storm outside had unlocked a part of her that had been dormant, a version of herself who knew how to dance with chaos. In the cabin, muffled voices rose. Someone cried out. A baby wailed. The turbulence had stripped away the illusion of safety. But here in the cockpit, a fragile order was holding, crafted by two pairs of hands refusing to let the sky win. The captain's jaw was tight, sweat tracing along his temple. But he glanced sideways at her again, and this time his look was something different. Not questioning, not wary. "Trust. You've done this before?" he said, almost to himself. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Not with 200 people behind me." A violent jolt shook the plane, throwing her forward in the harness. Warning lights flared again, alarms shrieking in protest. "Stabilizer trim issue," she read aloud. Her voice stayed level, clipped with military precision. "Manual input required. Your call," the captain said quickly. She swallowed, running calculations in her head faster than she thought possible. The procedure wasn't identical to a fighter, but the logic of flight was universal. Trust the instruments. Trust the airframe. Trust yourself. Compensate with yoke pressure. Keep throttle steady, she ordered. Don't fight the dip. Ride it, then correct. The captain followed her lead without hesitation. She leaned into the yoke, muscles straining, but the aircraft responded, leveling out with agonizing slowness. The alarms silenced one by one. The turbulence didn't vanish, but the storm had lost its grip on them. In the quiet that followed, her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She let out a slow breath, the kind that came only after walking a knife's edge and surviving. The captain exhaled too, finally releasing the tension in his shoulders. That was impressive. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained locked on the horizon, which now flickered with lightning far in the distance. To her, this wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about rediscovering the truth she had tried to bury, that the sky was part of her, and she could no more deny it than she could deny breathing. Finally, she said quietly, "It's not about skill. It's about staying calm when everyone else forgets how." The captain gave her a long look, then nodded in agreement. And tonight, we needed exactly that. Behind them, the passengers were still murmuring, their fear feeding on the unknown. They would never know just how close their flight had come to slipping into chaos. To them, the turbulence was just a bad patch of air. But in the cockpit, The woman from row 10 had proven something vital, not just to the captain, but to herself. She wasn't done. She wasn't broken. She wasn't just a relic of a former life. She was still a pilot. And the storm, in all its fury, had reminded her who she was meant to be. The cockpit settled into an uneasy calm. The instruments glowed steady again. The captain adjusted course slightly, giving the storm a wider berth. She leaned back in her seat, her body weary, but her spirit alive in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time since the captain's announcement, she allowed herself a small smile. Calm in the storm. That was who she had always been. And tonight, at 30,000 feet, the world had needed her to remember it. The storm eventually loosened its grip, as storms always did. What had been a violent rattling settled into a softer rhythm, the kind of turbulence most passengers dismissed as part of flying. But the energy in the cabin was different now, unsettled, buzzing with a nervous electricity. From behind the reinforced cockpit door came muffled voices. People whispered in tones that carried just far enough to feed curiosity. Children clutched parents' hands. Couples murmured reassurances they didn't quite believe. And more than one traveler sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the overhead light as though it held the secret to safety. None of them truly knew what had just happened. None of them knew how close the aircraft had come to slipping beyond control. But they did know one thing. Something unusual was happening up front. It started with a flight attendant, her expression pale but composed as she returned from the cockpit. She leaned toward another crew member, speaking in hushed tones. A passenger nearby overheard a phrase, "combat pilot," and the word spread like wildfire through the rows. A combat pilot? On board? Wait. You mean a passenger? Are you serious? Someone from back here went up front? It took only minutes for speculation to ripple through the cabin. Whispers bounced between rows like sparks across dry grass. The details were twisted, exaggerated, reshaped by imagination. Some swore she must have been called in because the captain was injured. Others were convinced terrorists had tried to hijack the plane. A few thought it was all a misunderstanding. But one fact remained. Someone among them had answered a call none of them could. She, the woman from row 10. Back in the cockpit, she sat quietly, eyes scanning the instrument panel as if it were second nature again. She didn't hear the rumors, didn't see the curious glances directed toward her empty seat in the cabin. She was too focused on the job, altitude steady, course adjusted, systems humming in uneasy cooperation. And yet, despite her focus, she felt something shift inside her. For years, she had buried her past beneath layers of silence, refusing to acknowledge the uniform, the medals, the memories. She had hidden the part of herself that once commanded skies. But now, here she was, not in a fighter jet, not on a mission of war, but still in a battle. A battle against gravity, chaos, and fear. And she was winning. The captain leaned back slightly, finally allowing himself to breathe without tension lacing every inhale. He studied her from the corner of his eye. You handled it like you never left the cockpit. Her lips pressed into a faint smile. My hands remembered, even if my mind tried to forget. He chuckled softly, though it carried no mockery, only respect. These people back there, they'll never know how close we came to trouble. Her gaze stayed forward, fixed on the horizon. They don't need to. If they land safely, that's all that matters. The captain gave a small nod, but his eyes lingered on her, filled with something beyond gratitude. Admiration, trust, recognition. In the cabin, passengers noticed her absence more acutely now. Row 10 felt hollow, a gap in the fabric of their uneasy community. The man who had sat beside her shifted uncomfortably, replaying the moments she had stood and followed the attendant forward. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now, realizing she might be the reason the plane was still level in the sky, his respect grew into something quiet, almost reverent. Nobody applauded. Nobody pointed. Nobody dared break the fragile equilibrium by making a spectacle of her. But in their hearts, passengers began weaving stories of the stranger among them, the woman who had risen when no one else could. Meanwhile, she felt none of it. She wanted none of it. Her role was not to bask in attention, but to protect those who didn't even know her name. That anonymity was strangely comforting. She wasn't performing for recognition. She was fulfilling duty, pure and simple. And yet, for the first time in years, she didn't shrink from who she was. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't just a shadow of her past. She was the woman who had stepped forward. She was the one the captain trusted with 200 lives. The silence between her and the captain stretched comfortably now, filled with the steady hum of the engines. Occasionally, he gave her updates, navigation clearances, fuel checks, routine adjustments. She responded with crisp efficiency, their teamwork seamless, as though they had flown together for years. But beneath the professional exchange, something unspoken grew. Respect, not the loud, showy kind. The silent, enduring kind that only comes when two people share responsibility under pressure and come out the other side stronger. Back in row 10, the whispers continued to swell. A teenager leaned toward her mother, eyes wide. "Mom, do you think she's like a real fighter pilot?" Her mother squeezed her hand, whispering back, "Whoever she is, she's the reason we're okay right now." The words, though never reaching the cockpit, seemed to echo all the same. The flight attendants moved more briskly now, their professionalism tinged with renewed confidence. They, too, had seen the quiet woman rise. They, too, had seen the calm she carried like a shield. And though none of them interrupted her focus, they carried her presence with them, drawing strength from it as they reassured nervous passengers. As the hours ticked by, the turbulence softened into nothing more than gentle bumps. The plane hummed with stability again, though exhaustion hung in the cockpit like a heavy curtain. She allowed herself a deep breath, her shoulders loosening slightly. But she knew better than to relax fully. The most dangerous part of any flight wasn't the storm in the sky. It was the landing. That thought sat heavy in her mind as the captain checked his charts. He looked at her, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "You realize," he said, "by the time we touch down, you'll have done more than just help. You'll have saved this flight." She met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "No, we'll save it. Together." He gave a slow nod, respect deepening. And in that small space of silence, she felt the truth settle in her bones. The passengers didn't need to know her story. They didn't need her name. They didn't even need to see her face. All that mattered was the landing ahead, and the knowledge that she would not, could not, fail them. The runway lights stretched ahead like a constellation falling to earth, bright beacons against the darkening night. Below, the city twinkled, sprawling and alive, oblivious to the drama unfolding above. In the cockpit, tension hummed quietly, the way it always did in the final minutes of descent. She leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning instruments, horizon, and runway, her hands steady on the yoke. Every movement was precise, measured, controlled, a dance of muscle memory and instinct that had lain dormant for years. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but taut. "We've got some crosswind on final. Brace for a little bounce." She nodded, acknowledging the challenge, already adjusting her approach calculations in milliseconds. Crosswind landings weren't new, but the stakes were higher here. 200 lives, passengers relying on skill and composure. "Flap set?" she asked, almost automatically, scanning the readouts. "All green," the captain confirmed. The plane dipped slightly as a gust hit the left wing. She felt the subtle tug in her harness, a vibration through the yoke. Her eyes flicked to the altimeter, vertical speed indicator, and the runway lights shimmering below. Every variable accounted for. Steady, steady. She muttered under her breath, more for herself than anyone else. Passengers, unaware of the cockpit's tension, felt only the faintest bump as the aircraft dipped and rose. A baby cried briefly, then quieted. A young man gripped the armrest, jaw tight. A woman whispered to her friend, "We're going to make it, aren't we?" "Yes," her heart silently answered. "We're going to make it." The plane shuddered again as the crosswind played its tug-of-war. She adjusted, nudging the yoke, compensating with subtle throttle adjustments. The landing gear touched the runway with a soft thump, then bounced lightly as the wheels kissed the tarmac. "Touchdown confirmed," she said, keeping her voice calm as the plane settled fully onto the runway. The captain exhaled audibly, though his voice remained composed. "Good work." That was perfect. She allowed herself the smallest smile, but it wasn't about pride. It was about fulfillment, about knowing she had answered the call she once tried to bury. The aircraft slowed smoothly, guided by precise braking and reverse thrust. Every passenger remained seated, oblivious to the fact that the final few hundred feet had required nerves, skill, and a quiet hero they would never meet. As the plane taxied to the gate, the hum of engines softened, replaced by the click and shuffle of cabin crew preparing for arrival. She glanced at the captain. "Passengers?" she asked. "They'll never know," he said, voice soft. "And that's just the way it should be." Her gaze shifted forward to the jet bridge, lights bright against the night. She felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. The flight was over, but the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins would linger long after everyone else disembarked. The plane came to a complete stop. The engines hummed down, systems powered off one by one, and the cockpit fell into near silence. The captain tapped a few buttons on the console, sending the final landing report to the control tower. "Time to go back," he said quietly. She nodded, removing her headset and loosening the harness. Her hands rested on her knees for a moment, as she allowed herself to exhale fully, letting the tension of hours dissipate. She had done her part. Lives had been protected. Chaos had been tamed. And yet, she felt no need for recognition. Leaving the cockpit, she stepped lightly down the narrow aisle of the plane. Passengers were standing now, stretching, gathering belongings, chatting quietly, the buzz of normalcy returning. No one looked at her differently. No one clapped or stared. She liked it that way. The man who had sat beside her on the flight leaned slightly toward her, giving a half-smile. "Guess you're back in your seat, huh?" She offered a small nod. Just another passenger now. He tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes, but didn't press. It was enough that she remained part of the world without needing to be celebrated. Back in row 10, she sank into her seat, smoothing her jacket, hands clasped quietly in her lap. Around her, life returned to normal. Luggage was stowed. A baby cried again. A teenager tapped nervously on his phone. She exhaled slowly, letting the rhythm of ordinary life wash over her. She glanced out the window at the tarmac, where ground crew moved efficiently, unaware of the storm she had tamed, the invisible thread of calm she had woven through the chaos. For the first time in years, she felt wholly herself, strong, capable, unshuckable, yet entirely anonymous. The captain's voice over the intercom, calm and polite, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your destination. Thank you for flying with us." No one could know how much weight those words carried, how many lives had been quietly preserved because someone had chosen to act. Her eyes closed for a moment, just briefly. The memories of the past hours, The storm, the turbulence, the instruments responding to her touch, floated around her like echoes in an empty hangar. And then she opened them again, staring at the bustling cabin, at passengers collecting belongings, at life resuming as if nothing had happened. She smiled faintly, a secret smile. For the first time in years, she didn't have to run. She didn't have to hide. She had faced the sky, answered the call, and returned quietly to her seat. Row 10 was hers again. Anonymous, ordinary, safe, but she knew something had changed. Inside, beneath the surface of quiet composure, a fire burned. She had answered when the sky called. She had saved lives. And she had discovered finally that she could never truly hide from who she was. The plane came to a final stop. Engines powered down. Passengers stood, stretching and chatting. She watched them, calm, centered, knowing the truth that no one else would ever know. A landing remembered. A flight saved. A hero returned, quietly, invisibly, entirely herself. The hum of the engines faded into silence. Row 10 held its secret, and so did she. And somewhere above, where the sky still stretched in endless possibility, she knew she would answer the call again if it came.